New today, civil rights attorney Ben Crump says an anonymous complaint against Christine Wells Wansley is meant to silence her.
Here's what we've learned so far. The Mississippi Board of Nursing is investigating Wansley, a longtime Mississippi nurse and the mother of Nolan Wells, for professional misconduct after an anonymous report. Nolan Wells is the 18-year-old from Ocean Springs found dead on Horde Island last month. Crump says Wansley has never had a prior complaint and argues the case is intimidation as she pushes for answers about her son's death.
Christine Wansley spent her whole career being unremarkable in exactly the way you want a nurse to be. She showed up. She did the job right. For years, as a family medicine nurse practitioner at a clinic on the Mississippi coast, nobody ever wrote her name down for the wrong reason. No complaints, no board reviews, no black marks on a license she'd held long enough to stop thinking about it as fragile. Then, in the span of a few weeks in the summer of 2026, that record vanished under something else entirely. Not a mistake with a patient, not a misdiagnosis, not a broken protocol. An anonymous complaint filed with the Mississippi Board of Nursing by someone who would not put their name on it, filed only after Christine Wansley started asking, loudly and in public, what had happened to her son. On August 5th, the board closed that complaint. No discipline, no finding against her. And the family's attorney, a man named Ben Crump, who has spent 2 decades building a career out of cases just like this one, did not describe what had happened as a bureaucratic mix-up. It was a warning shot at a grieving mother, Crump said, meant to pressure and scare her into staying quiet.
First, I want to give all thanks and honor and glory to God for choosing Elmore and me to be Nolan's parents. We thank you, Lord, for the beautiful 18 years that you blessed us with him. Thank you for the joy he brought not only to our family, but also to his friends and everyone in the community whose lives he touched. Nolan had such a gentle, calming spirit about him. He had a way of making people feel seen, welcome, and valued. He could lift your confidence with just a few words and make you feel like you belonged. If you ever had the privilege of meeting our son Nolan or calling him a friend, then you experienced a glimpse of God's love through him. He was both protective and nurturing. He often told us that one day he wanted to have 3 daughters that he would name Sophia, Charlotte, and Olivia. He had a deep love for the Lord and an unwavering faith that was evident in the way he lived his life. We will miss everything about him, from his quiet nature to the corny jokes, his gentle smile, the way he made everyone around him feel comfortable, loved, and at ease. Your absence has left an emptiness that can never truly be filled. A piece of our hearts will always be missing. Nolan, your father and I are incredibly proud of you.
This is the story of that warning shot, where it came from, what it was built to do, and why, more than a month into a case that has already pulled in a county sheriff, a sitting judge, and a nationally known civil rights attorney, a stranger with no connection to any of it decided the fastest way to make Christine Wansley stop talking was to go after the one thing she had never once had to defend, her right to do her job. Crump himself is not a stranger to cases that unfold exactly this way. He has represented the families of Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor, among others. Cases where a private death became a national argument, and where the family at the center of it found themselves living 2 lives at once, grieving in private and defending that grief in public against people who had never met the person they'd lost. By the time Crump agreed to represent the Wansley family, he had seen this exact pattern before. What was different this time was the specific shape the pressure took. Not just online noise, not just hostile commentary, but a formal complaint routed through a state licensing board, aimed at revoking the very career that let Christine support the family she had left. To understand why someone would reach for that particular weapon, you have to go back to the beginning. To a boat, an island, and a boy named Nolan. Nolan Xavier Wells was born on August 19, 2007, the youngest of Christine's 6 children, a younger brother to Carlisha, Jalen, Jaden, and Ethan, and the baby of Christine and Elmore's own household. He grew up in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, a town on the Gulf Coast small enough that most people there could tell you who he was before this summer. He played multiple sports through high school, graduated in 2025, and went on to play football at Southwest Mississippi Community College. The people who knew him described the same handful of things over and over in interview after interview: that he was well liked, that he was close to his family, that he had a future in front of him that did not look anything like this. At his funeral, his mother would tell the church something almost unbearably specific, that Nolan had already picked out names for the children he planned to have one day. It's the kind of detail that doesn't belong in a story about licensing boards and federal complaints, and it's also exactly why this story keeps returning to Christine Wansley, because the fight over her nursing license only makes sense once you understand what and who she's actually fighting for. On the evening of July 3rd, Nolan told his parents he'd be spending the 4th of July weekend with friends. He left later that night. The next morning, a boat carrying Nolan and a group of friends left the Mississippi coast at 4 minutes to 10 and landed on the western tip of Horn Island a little over an hour later, a barrier island roughly 10 miles offshore, federally protected, empty except for the roughly 300 people who had made the same trip that day for the holiday. Nolan was last seen alive around 3 that afternoon on the island's northwestern tip. His friends left the island later that day. They told investigators there had been boat trouble and that Nolan had chosen to stay behind, in the company, they said, of a young woman they could not immediately name. That woman would later be identified publicly as Katie McCormick, 19 years old, and her account of that afternoon has never lined up perfectly with the account given by Nolan's friends, a discrepancy her own sister has pointed to directly, in public, more than once. Separately, a boat known locally as the Mac Daddy appears in 2 pieces of footage from that day, filmed roughly 3 hours apart, and its exact role in Nolan's final hours is still not something investigators have explained on the record. Christine reported her son missing that evening. 2 days later, on the morning of July 6th, a National Park Service ranger found him on the island's northwestern shore. What came after was not a quiet grief. An independent autopsy, commissioned by the family and conducted in Washington, D.C., returned a finding of undetermined, pending investigation. The state's own autopsy was completed by the end of July, and rather than being released publicly, it was sent directly to a Jackson County grand jury. Standard practice, the district attorney's office said, for any death in the county that isn't from natural causes or a routine traffic accident. On July 20th, hundreds of people packed Center Point Church in Ocean Springs for Nolan's funeral. The filmmaker Spike Lee and former NFL wide receiver Terrell Owens were among those who came. The Reverend Al Sharpton delivered the eulogy, and Christine stood in front of the church and told the room what everyone could already see on her face, that her son's absence had left an emptiness that could never truly be filled. Elmore, Nolan's father, made his own appeal that day too, one aimed less at grief and more at the friends who had been on that island. "If Nolan was really your best friend," he said, "for the people who say they were friends, please come forward and tell us what you know. "We're not blaming anyone. We just want the truth." By then, Christine and Elmore had already done something a grieving parent shouldn't have to think about doing within days of burying a child. They had hired a lawyer and started holding press conferences. Not because they wanted the attention, because nobody was giving them answers. Crump, alongside Sharpton, stood next to them on more than one occasion and made the case plainly. That Nolan was, in Crump's words, a good kid, a college athlete, someone who had everything going for him, and that the contradictions in the story of his final hours were exactly what made the case impossible to look away from. Christine herself put it more simply, standing at a podium in front of cameras she never asked to be in front of. "This is not how I wanted the world to meet my son, but here we are. If anyone knows anything, his friends, strangers, anyone, please call the hotline, because we will not rest until we get answers." That press conference on July 20th wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. 10 days earlier, Crump and Sharpton had stood with the family calling for what they described as a full, transparent, and urgent investigation, before an independent autopsy had even been ordered. Later, after a meeting with the Jackson County District Attorney's Office, the family held another news conference to lay out what had and hadn't been shared with them. By the end of July, Crump was raising the case again at the National Urban League's annual conference, folding Nolan's name into a broader argument he has made in city after city, case after case, about how black families are treated when they demand answers the system isn't in a hurry to give them. Each appearance put Christine back in front of a camera. Each one meant another round of coverage, another round of commentary, and, increasingly, another round of people online who had never met her deciding they had something to say about how she was grieving. That advocacy is where this particular story actually starts. Because roughly 3 weeks after Nolan's death made national headlines, something began showing up that had nothing to do with tide charts or timelines or phone records. It showed up on Christine's employer's website, Memorial Physician Clinics, where she has practiced for years, on the page where patients leave reviews for their nurse practitioner. 1 star, then another. Supporters flagged the pattern almost immediately. A sudden wave of negative reviews on Christine's professional profile, appearing not because of anything that had happened in an exam room, but in the 2 weeks after she stopped coming to work to bury her son and start demanding answers about how he died. Some outlets that looked into it afterward couldn't independently confirm every review or trace exactly where each one had come from, and said as much. What wasn't in dispute was the timing. The reviews arrived only after Christine's face and her son's name were on the news together, and supporters of the family were blunt about what they believed was actually happening, calling it, in the words used publicly at the time, another example of systemic racism and attempts at oppression. Crump was just as blunt. "Christine has been a nurse for years," he said, "and she hasn't ever gotten negative reviews. But since she's been advocating for her son since he washed up dead on Horn Island, sick people have been going on her company's website giving her negative reviews." The reviews didn't happen in a vacuum. By late July, a specific strain of content had taken hold across parts of true crime and commentary YouTube, videos built entirely around casting doubt on Christine herself. Titles accused her, without much in the way of evidence, of lying to investigators or contradicting her own story. Others focused on statements she'd made in interviews, reframing them as inflammatory rather than grief-stricken. None of these videos were the anonymous complaint. None of them could be. But they built something the complaint needed in order to work, a public appetite for the idea that Christine Wansley wasn't a grieving mother asking hard questions, but a woman who couldn't be trusted. Sonny Hostin raised the case on The View. Commentators on both sides of the aisle weighed in, some defending the family outright, others, like the sports commentator Jason Whitlock, publicly airing frustration with how the advocacy was being run. A New York Post piece quoted the father of one of Nolan's friends calling Crump's accusations something that didn't deserve a response. None of that is illegal. All of it is protected opinion, the ordinary noise of a case that has gone national. But it is also, whether anyone intended it this way, exactly the kind of atmosphere that makes an anonymous licensing complaint look, to the person who files it, like a reasonable thing to do instead of an act of harassment. The reviews were the first sign. The credibility campaign online was the current underneath it. And the complaint to the Mississippi Board of Nursing was the third step, the one with actual teeth. A professional misconduct complaint to a state nursing board is not a comment section. It opens a formal review that can, in theory, put a license on the line. It exists, by design, to protect patients from nurses who have genuinely done something wrong, which meant that whoever filed the anonymous complaint against Christine Wansley was either accusing her of misconduct that, notably, nobody had ever raised in all her years of practice, or was reaching for the machinery built to protect patients and pointing it at something else entirely. A mother who would not stop asking questions. It's worth being specific about what a family medicine nurse practitioner actually does, because the job itself is what made this particular attack land so precisely. Christine's work was never abstract. It meant diagnosing the patients other providers didn't have time for, managing prescriptions, catching the small things before they became big ones, the unglamorous, hands-on work of a Gulf Coast primary care clinic. A license like that isn't a credential sitting in a drawer. It's the thing that let her support her family in a household with 6 children, long before anyone outside Ocean Springs had ever heard her name. Whoever filed the complaint against her did not just risk a bureaucratic inconvenience. They risked her ability to keep doing the job that had defined her entire adult life over a set of public statements that had nothing whatsoever to do with how she treated a single patient. Crump's full written statement, released that same day, did not treat the closure as the end of the story. He treated it as confirmation of what he had suspected from the start. The complaint against Christine Wells Wansley has been closed, he said, and it should never have been filed in the first place. It was frivolous, it was unfounded, and it was never about patient care. It was an attempt to distract a grieving mother and intimidate her into silence, filed by someone who would not put their name on it. He went further, calling it a distraction, calling it intimidation outright, and then landing on the line that reframes the whole story. Attacking a grieving mother's career does not answer the question of what happened to Nolan. It tells us the question matters, and the answer is scaring somebody. Sit with that sentence for a moment, because it's doing more work than it looks like on the surface. Crump isn't only arguing that the complaint was unfair to Christine. He's making an argument about motive, that somebody, somewhere, wanted her to stop asking questions badly enough to go after her career instead of just arguing with her online. It's worth asking why someone would choose a licensing board at all, when there were so many easier ways to harass her. A comment section, a review page, an anonymous message. A complaint to a state board is slower than any of those, and quieter, and it doesn't announce itself the way a nasty comment does. But it is also, in a specific way, more dangerous, because it doesn't just wound Christine's feelings. It puts her paycheck, her insurance, and her ability to provide for the 5 children she has left on a bureaucratic timer that she cannot control and cannot see the inside of. Whoever filed it either understood that or stumbled into it anyway. Either way, the effect is the same. It is harder to keep standing in front of cameras demanding answers about your son when you are simultaneously worried about whether you will still have a job by the end of the month. Whether the motive Crump described is provable is a separate question from whether it's plausible, and a closed licensing complaint can't answer either one on its own. But it doesn't sit in isolation. Because Christine Wansley was not the only person connected to this case who has spent the past several weeks on the receiving end of exactly this kind of pressure. She was simply the first one whose attacker hid behind a licensing board instead of a phone. By the first week of August, federal prosecutors had filed charges against 3 separate people in 3 separate states for threats connected to the Nolan Wells case. None of the 3 knew Nolan. None of them knew his family, his friends, or anyone actually involved in the investigation. They were strangers who had watched the case unfold from a distance and decided, each in their own way, to insert themselves into it with a phone and a keyboard. The first was Joseph Alfredo Vasquez Dumars, arrested in Sacramento, California, and indicted on a felony count for sending threatening messages over Facebook, not to a witness, not to a friend of the family, but to Ashley Cole, a Jackson County Chancery judge who happened to be the mother of one of the young men who had been on Horn Island with Nolan. A judge threatened for a case she wasn't even the one deciding, because her son had been in the wrong boat on the wrong afternoon. Dumars had never set foot in Mississippi. He knew the case only from what he'd read online, and decided that a judge's family was a fair target anyway. The second was Michelle Francine Edwards of Ohio, accused of phoning in bomb threats to 2 separate government offices, the George County Chancery Clerk's Office and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, both agencies with employees who had nothing to do with deciding the outcome of the case at all. Neither office had any power to speed up a grand jury process that frustrated observers online had apparently decided was moving too slowly. The threats didn't target an investigator or a suspect. They targeted a building and everyone inside it over a decision that hadn't even been made yet. The third arrest was the ugliest. Edward James Porter, 40 years old, of Berwyn, Illinois, is accused of calling a witness in the case, twice, from an apartment building in the Chicago suburbs, and telling that witness he was going to come and kill them and their family. Porter, prosecutors say, had the witness's home address and made sure they knew it. He is accused of threatening a second witness the same way, telling them he would kill everyone in the house, kill any officer who tried to stop him, and describing, in graphic and deliberate terms, exactly what he intended to do afterward. None of it has anything to do with what happened on Horn Island. It's about how far a total stranger, watching from 1,000 miles away, was willing to go to frighten 2 people he had never met in his life. Porter was tracked down the way most of these cases are: subpoenas to his phone carrier, an IP address, a paper trail he apparently made no effort to hide. He made his first appearance at the federal courthouse in Chicago before a judge ordered him removed to Mississippi to face the charges there. All 3 arrests came out of a joint effort between local investigators and the FBI, which opened its own probe into the threats once it became clear the case had drawn in people far outside Mississippi, in states that had never had any connection to Horn Island at all. That federal involvement is itself a signal of how far this has traveled, a local death investigation that has, indirectly, become a federal harassment case, running on a completely separate track from the question of what actually happened to Nolan. Put Porter, Dumars, and Edwards next to the anonymous complaint against Christine Wansley, and a pattern comes into focus that none of them, on their own, quite reveals. A judge's mother gets threatened over Facebook. 2 county offices get bomb threats meant to pressure an investigation that isn't theirs to speed up. A man in Illinois threatens to kill 2 witnesses in language too graphic to repeat in full. And a grieving mother, whose only public act has been to stand in front of cameras and ask what happened to her son, gets reported to a licensing board by someone too afraid to sign their own name. None of these people knew each other. None of them were coordinated in any legal sense. What they share isn't a plan. It's a target and a pattern of choosing the softest, least accountable way to attack it. Every person connected to this case who has tried to move it forward, whether by testifying, presiding over it, or simply refusing to stop asking questions in public, has drawn the same kind of anonymous, disproportionate aggression from people who were never part of the story until they decided to insert themselves into it. There's a wider layer to this too, one that doesn't involve threats or complaints at all, but the same underlying tension. In late July, the NAACP's national president, Derek Johnson, stood at a press conference alongside the family and accused Mississippi officials of being, in his words, derelict in their duties in how the case was being handled. Mississippi state officials pushed back hard and fast. A state senator, Jeremy England, defended the sheriff and district attorney publicly, insisting they had the utmost integrity, that they understood they were under a microscope, but that they were, in his own words, being unfairly attacked. Two sides, neither one accusing the other of a crime. Just two camps that have decided they can't both be right about how this investigation is being run. And that disagreement, playing out on camera week after week, is part of what has kept this case at a boiling point instead of settling into the quiet grind most death investigations disappear into. It's the same argument, really, just at the institutional level instead of the personal one. Is the system handling this the way it's supposed to? Or is it failing a family because of who that family is? Nobody watching this case from the outside has to resolve that argument to notice that it's the exact same question sitting underneath the fight over Christine Wansley's nursing license. That climate is worth understanding because it's the air this case has been breathing since the week Nolan's funeral drew hundreds of mourners and two names famous enough to pull the story onto a bigger stage than a Mississippi barrier island would otherwise command. The bigger the spotlight got, the more strangers decided they had a stake in how it ended. And the honest answer is that nobody outside a small circle of investigators actually knows how it ends yet. 2. Credible, informed voices in this case do not agree with each other, and it is worth laying out both plainly without pretending either one has been proven. Jennifer Coffindaffer, a former FBI agent who has followed the case closely and spoken publicly about it, has said that what she has seen, the surveillance footage that exists, the accounts from roughly 60 witnesses interviewed so far, the riptide conditions known to affect that stretch of the Gulf, points toward an accident, not foul play. As of the second week of August, Mississippi authorities had not publicly named a suspect or stated that they believed Nolan's death was the result of a crime. On the other side, Crump's own investigative team has kept digging in ways that suggest they are not satisfied with that reading. Forensic audio specialists working for the family have been examining the C-TOW emergency call placed the day Nolan went missing, listening for details that didn't make it into the transcripts already made public. Ocean engineers brought in independently have been trying to reconcile how Nolan came to be found on the island's northwestern tip with what the tide patterns that day would predict, a detail that, on paper, doesn't fully line up. An independent review of the available photos, video, GPS data, and witness accounts concluded that there remains what people close to the family have called a material gap, a stretch of time between Nolan's last confirmed sighting and the moment he was found that the public record still doesn't fully explain. Part of what's kept that gap open is footage that keeps surfacing on its own, months after the fact, from people who were on the island that day and are only now coming forward. In early August, a video recorded at 17 minutes past 11 on the morning of July 4th resurfaced, showing a boat bearing the name Mac Daddy near the island. The same boat that appears in a separate piece of footage time-stamped roughly 3 hours later at 23 minutes past 2 that afternoon. A second video, filmed elsewhere on the island, appears to show someone in swim trunks matching the color of the ones Nolan was last photographed wearing. Neither clip has been authenticated by investigators. Neither has been tied definitively to Nolan's actual movements that day, but each one adds another loose thread to a timeline that, more than a month later, still hasn't been fully stitched together in public. And every loose thread is one more thing for the more aggressive corners of the internet to seize on. Both of these things can be true at once. That the physical evidence known so far may ultimately point toward a tragic accident, and that specific documented questions about the timeline remain open, unanswered, and unresolved. That tension, real uncertainty sitting right next to real public pressure, is exactly the kind of gap that online speculation rushes to fill. And it is exactly the kind of gap that has, this summer, produced bomb threats against a sheriff's office, death threats against witnesses, and an anonymous complaint against a nurse whose only offense was refusing to go quiet. What that means, practically, is that Christine Wansley will learn the contents of her son's autopsy the same way the rest of the public eventually will. After a room of strangers she'll never meet decides what to do with it first. A grand jury, for anyone who hasn't sat through one of these cases before, isn't a trial. It's a closed-door review, prosecutors on one side laying out evidence, a panel of ordinary citizens on the other, deciding whether there's enough to bring formal charges at all. No defense is presented there. No verdict of innocence or guilt comes out of it. Only a decision about whether the case goes forward. Under Mississippi's process, the medical examiner's findings go to that panel first, before they ever reach a headline, which is part of why the sealed autopsy has become such a flashpoint. For a mother who has already waited weeks longer than she expected to, that silence is its own kind of wait. And for an online audience with no patience left for waiting at all, it's the exact kind of silence that, this summer, has repeatedly curdled into threats instead of patience. It's also worth saying clearly what this story is not. A document claiming to be a toxicology report has circulated widely on social media in recent weeks, and Mississippi state officials have gone out of their way to say, on the record, that it is not authentic. No official toxicology results have been released to the public at any point in this investigation. If you have seen one shared as fact, it wasn't one. This case has produced enough real, documented pressure on this family without anyone needing to invent more. Nolan Wells's official autopsy sits sealed, waiting on a Jackson County grand jury that will decide, based on evidence the public still has not seen, whether anyone will ever be charged in connection with his death. That process moves on its own schedule, and nothing in this story changes that. What has changed, as of the first week of August, is smaller, and in some ways more telling. A licensing board looked at an anonymous accusation against an 18-year-old's mother, found nothing behind it, and closed the file. Christine Wansley's record is clean again, in the narrow sense that a board found nothing on it. But a clean record was never really the point, and neither was a license, and neither, in the end, was one anonymous complaint. What was actually being tested this summer was much simpler: whether a mother who buried her son could be made to stop asking who was responsible by threatening the one part of her life that had nothing to do with him at all. She didn't stop. She kept showing up at press conferences. She kept standing next to Crump and Sharpton and saying the same thing in a dozen different ways, on a dozen different cameras, that she would not rest until she knew what happened to her son. The complaint is closed now, folded into a file somewhere at the Mississippi Board of Nursing, unlikely to be looked at again. The reviews, whatever became of them, didn't cost her the clinic. The online campaign questioning her credibility didn't produce a single fact that held up. And the 3 people now facing federal charges for threatening a judge, a sheriff's office, and 2 witnesses will have to answer for that in a courtroom that has nothing to do with what happened to Nolan on Horn Island. None of that gives her back what she actually lost. A closed complaint doesn't undo the weeks she spent worrying, in the middle of burying her son, about whether a stranger's anonymous letter was going to cost her the ability to support the children she has left. Vindication, in a story like this one, rarely restores anything. It just confirms that the attack shouldn't have happened in the first place. Christine Wansley didn't get her job protected because the system moved quickly to defend her. She got it protected because after weeks of scrutiny, investigators could not find a single thing she had actually done wrong. That's not victory. That's just the absence of a false accusation finally being recognized for what it was. What's left, after all of it, is the same as what was there at the start. A mother without her son, a licensing board with an empty file where a complaint used to be, and a case that is still, more than a month later, waiting on a grand jury that hasn't spoken. If this story has stayed with you, it's worth remembering something about how these situations usually unfold. The loudest attempts to silence a grieving family rarely come from inside the investigation itself. They come from the edges, from strangers who were never part of the story until they decided to insert themselves into it, hoping nobody would notice what they were actually trying to do. This time, somebody noticed, and said so, publicly, with her name still on the record. Subscribe for the next update on the Nolan Wells case, because the grand jury still hasn't spoken, and neither has this family, not by a long way.